think it looks like it's settled on a number. So, hello everybody. Welcome to you to the University of Wolverhampton. We are hosting our Royal Institute of Philosophy lecture, and we have with us today Dr. Stefano Kipper, who is going to speak on Overinterpellation, Reassessing Althusser's Theory of Ideology. Stefano is an old friend. Stefano did his PhD in 2016 at CRMEP, Kingston University, and in 2016, and he started teaching shortly afterwards at the University of Wolverhampton. He was with us for about 2 years, 2016 to 2018, during which time he developed new courses with us. He made many new friends. He added life and spirit to the University of Wolverhampton, gave us a huge intellectual boost, and we miss him very much since he left in 2018. Stefano has published quite a lot in journal articles, in radical philosophy, in others. He has a monograph on Althusser and contingency, which Neversave International published, and he's currently working on another book, which is Theory of Ideology and Interpellation in Althusser, Pescio, and Laclau. So Stefano is now a research fellow in Milano Bicocca, and he is always going to be very welcome to come back and teach with us whenever Stefano decides not to be in Italy. It doesn't look like it's going to happen in the near future because Stefano loves to be in Italy. And of course, as his talk today will also tell us, Stefano is someone who wants to find a way for making room for resistance and not to rest in passivity. And so he's going to rescue, I think, Althusser from criticisms of the kind that make us think that Althusser's thought engenders passivity. Stefano's going to say no, and let's see how he does that today. So welcome, Stefano, and we look forward to hearing you. I must tell everybody that the event is being recorded. So please be assured that do not put any private information or content in either the QA or the chat box. The chat box is going to be open the whole time, but use it only if you want to send sweet messages to Stefano. I'm sure some of you friends of Stefano who are in the UK and everywhere in the world might want to do that. But for your Q&A and comments, please use only the Q&A box, otherwise I might miss them. Stefano will speak for about 35-40 minutes at most, and we will launch into Q&A straight after. You can, of course, put your questions anytime you want in Q&A, and I will surely take them in the order they arrive at the end of the talk. So over to you, Stefano.
Thank you very much, Mina. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I just want to say that I hope to be able to come back, to be back in Wolverhampton to visit you and old friends as soon as it is possible after the pandemic. But in the meantime, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here for this lecture. So you presented my talk very well. This is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm trying to counter some criticism to Althusser's theory of ideology. Okay, just 1 second. Okay, I would like basically in this paper to reread Althusser's thesis on ideology and propose some ideas around the notion of interpellation. I will not talk about all aspects of Althusser's theory of ideology or the different phases of its elaboration, because this would arguably take too much time. Rather, I shall directly discuss the notion of interpellation and some of the problems that it posed when it was first published, and then in the following debates, very heated debates, and some of the problems that it still poses, attempting to develop these problems in the direction of what I shall call overinterpellation. The rationale behind my paper is basically twofold. First, I think that Althusser's theory of ideology is far richer and more complex than it is usually admitted. Secondly, I also think that the reinterpretation of it, in the sense I'm going to suggest, could be useful for us today to understand the complexity of the production of subjectivity and the processes of subjection. I must say from the outset, however, that I will focus mainly on the first aspect, given the need first to clear the ground for the very idea of overinterpellation before talking about how we can use the concept, perhaps, for political and social analysis. So let's start by sketching out very briefly how Althusser arrived at conceptualizing interpellation. The standard reference for Althusser's theory of ideology and interpellation is his famous 1970 essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, published on La Pensée, as is well known. Here, Althusser argued that the Marxist tradition lacked an accurate understanding of what ideology is and how it operates. He maintained that if one wants to understand ideology, it is necessary to take up the point of view of reproduction, that is, to place oneself from the perspective of the reproduction of a certain mode of production. The first thesis of the essay is therefore that far from being a sheer epiphenomenon of the economic instance, like it was conceptualized in orthodox Marxism, the role of the superstructure as a whole is to intervene in a decisive way in the process of reproduction of a determinate mode of production. Drawing on Gramsci, Althusser argues that a certain class can dominate when it can control not just the repressive apparatus, which is the moment of force in Gramscian terminology, but also the ideological state apparatuses, the moment of consent in Gramsci's terminology. Ideological apparatuses are institutions in which certain discourses are produced and certain practices performed. They are the site, Althusser says, in which the ideology of the dominant class is realized. Fundamentally, their aim is twofold: to fashion a certain specific type of subject capable of fulfilling the requirements of the economic base, like trained doctors, engineers, electricians, intellectuals, like universities and so forth. At the same time, inculcating a certain kind of spontaneous, which is not spontaneous at all, beliefs that make it possible to reproduce the existing relations of production. The second thesis of the essay regards precisely the way in which this inculcation is achieved. To explain this, Althusser puts forth his thesis of ideology in general, according to which ideology interpellates individuals as subjects. When we are interpellated, we recognize ourselves, says Althusser, in the call coming from ideology, exemplified in the famous example of the "Hey vous là-bas," "Hey you there," coming from the policeman, or in the call coming from God, thus introjecting the image of ourselves reflected in such a call, while we misrecognize the very mechanism of imposition of such identity upon us. The subjection to ideology provides the subject with the guarantee of their identity and their place in the world. They recognize that they really are what they are, and that everything is how it should be, says Althusser. The result of the interpellation, which is embedded in the everyday practices of the ideological apparatuses, in their rituals, as Althusser says, is that we function spontaneously as subjects that actively reproduce the current relations of production. As he says, les sujets marchent tout seuls, subjects march by themselves. So broadly speaking, the thesis on ideology and reproduction as presented in the ISA essay, where they are intimately related, immediately raised a series of objections, which still constitute to this day the standard reception of Althusser's theory of ideology. For the sake of brevity, we can group them into three main problems allegedly undermining his theory. The first one is the problem of functionalism, which is perhaps the most fundamental criticism leveled against Althusser, and still the most persistent. From a philosophical point of view, Althusser is generally accused of thinking that a certain societal organization can posit its own presuppositions, which in philosophical parlance is an allegation of straightforward idealism. Clearly, if a certain mode of production produces the subject that produces it and reproduce it, then there will never be an end to this mode of production. Furthermore, from a political point of view, it can be accused of rendering it impossible to think of change, which is perhaps a problem in itself, but becomes even more so if, like Althusser, one is a Marxist. The issue is even thornier given, and this is the second problem, the relative minor role attributed by Althusser to class struggle in this essay, for the absence of which he was readily attacked. To be sure, it is not entirely true that the notion of class struggle is totally missing from his ISA essay. There are some passages that explicitly mentions it, and as Althusser protested, it is especially present in the postscript, in which he warned that his ideas were only notes towards an investigation, and where he attempted to ward off the problem of functionalism by calling attention to the need of taking into account antagonism and class struggle. But even a certainly sympathetic reader, such as Warren Montag, notes quite correctly, I think, that, and I quote from Montag, to present class struggle conceived as an antidote to functionalism in a postscript, and therefore outside the development of his argument, is to render it superfluous, nothing more than an afterthought, end quote. The third problem is the fate of the subject, which Mina also mentioned in the introduction. Subjects are produced, according to Althusser, and therefore, critics noted, are passive. They are deprived, in his theory, of any capacity of resistance, agency, or freedom. Not only does this clash with a specifically modern understanding of the notion of the subject, like post-Kantian idea of the subject, but also, so is argued, with common sense, with how we think of ourselves, etc. Now, after presenting briefly the main thesis of Althusser's essay and its reception, let's say what I take to be the sedimented image of Althusser's theory, as it is still found in many recent publications, I can better specify my aim today. My objective now is to argue, one, that Althusser's theory, despite certain formulations and despite certain objective tendencies in his writings, can be reconstructed in a non-functionalist way. And two, that by contrast, it opens up an interesting way to think about the freedom in a materialist way. In order to do this, I will turn to a book that was published posthumously in 1993 in French, but was only translated into English in 2014, whose title is Sur la reproduction, and in English, On the Reproduction of Capitalism, which offers some interesting materials to complicate and to a certain extent revise his notion of interpellation. This book is in fact the long manuscript from which the article I mentioned, the ISA essay, was taken. But it presents some key differences that can be exploited to reinterpret Althusser's theory. Overall, one can certainly say that in this book-length study, Althusser's point of view is richer, more nuanced, and more historical than it is in the published article. But the key difference, at least for my purposes, turns around the conceptual role played in it by the notion of class struggle and antagonism. Whereas in the published article, class struggle comes into play later in the exposition, as we saw it emerges forcefully, as Montag and others pointed out, only in the postscript. In this manuscript, it is present from the very beginning, thus playing an important role in Althusser's inquiry into the dynamics of reproduction of a determinate social formation. In the opening pages, Althusser recognizes that he must immediately confront a problem, which is the problem familiar to Marxists of the order of exposition. It is impossible, he says, to talk about the superstructure which is state apparatuses, ideology, and law, without bringing class struggle into play. But, he immediately adds, it is equally impossible, I quote, to talk about classes and class struggle without first talking about the state, law, and ideology, end quote. Given this conundrum, Althusser explains in what I consider to be a key passage that class struggle will be present in his analysis in a very peculiar way. It will be present, I quote, and this is the first passage in the handout, it will be present by way of a whole series of effects that remain unintelligible unless we refer to its reality and presence outside the objects we analyze, but inside them as well. We shall constantly have to bring its effects into play without first having provided a thorough explanation of their causes, end quote. So this methodological remark, however debatable may Althusser's solution appear, makes on the reproduction of capitalism more attentive to the internal dynamics of the ideological state apparatuses with respect to the article. Because class struggle appears in it through its effects, that is, not so much in person as an object of direct theorization, but as an absent cause, whose nature is not investigated as such, but whose effects are visible and present in the conceptualization of the objects under study. Indeed, not only does Althusser pay great attention to the process of constitution of a state ideology following the seizure of power by a determinate class, he also stresses the internal differences in terms of temporality between the seizure of power and the construction or the readjustment, let's say, of an adequate ensemble of ideological state apparatuses, which requires, he says, a long and constant confrontation with different ideological forces. A key aspect of Althusser's analysis in these pages is that he considers the unity of the state ideology itself as problematic, or better, as only ever tendential, only as a result of a battle internal to the ideological domain. Returning on this capital point a few years later, Althusser will say that there is an irreducible and non-totalizable multiplicity, and I quote, in the materiality of ideologies. A multiplicity that, because it could not be totally unified in the ancient dominant ideology, neither can it be reabsorbed in the unity of the new dominant ideology, end quote. If it is so, it is because the conflict operating at the heart of a social formation works to impede the closure of the dominant ideology, its full constitution, so to speak. Here we have a quite clear, although not explicit, statement of a general thesis that I propose to sum up as follows. The dominant ideology is a not one. However, the effects of the absent cause of class struggle are most evident where Althusser introduces a distinction that is surprisingly, at least for us today, for the potential theoretical consequence that this may have had, surprisingly absent from the ISA essay. After explaining that the ideological apparatuses realize the state ideology, he distinguishes between two types of ideology that he calls primary and secondary ideology, or secondary or subordinated ideologies sometimes. We must distinguish, he argues, between the elements of primary ideology, which is the state ideology, present in the practices of a certain apparatus, and the practices produced in this apparatus due to the pressure of external factors. As he writes, and also this passage is present in your handout, these secondary ideologies are produced by a conjunction of complex causes, among which figure alongside the practice in question, the effects of other external practices, of exterior ideologies, and in the last instance, however dissimulated, the distant effects which are actually very close of class struggle, end quote. What we have here is precisely the conceptualization of the effects of the absent cause of class struggle, which we talked about a moment ago. In fact, it is important to note that the secondary ideology is not understandable as a reaction to the state ideology produced by practices in a spontaneous way, but as the effect of something external to the apparatus in question. Or to be more precise, they must be understood as the effect of the specific configuration of the struggle between classes at a given moment in each social formation. From this point of view, Althusser, I think, can hardly be criticized for his functionalism, as what is introduced here is the problem of a relation of forces between struggling classes, fractions, or groups within the moment of the reproduction of the conditions of production. If the state ideology realizes itself in the ideological state apparatuses, and if their task is to inculcate the dominant ideology, which is the ideology of the state, this process is not at all a smooth one. On the contrary, Althusser in fact writes, quote, that this does not take place without contradictions, and that the ideological subformations produced in the apparatuses by their own practices should sometimes make the gears grate and grind is inevitable, end quote. If the introduction of this perspective counters the allegation of functionalism, it nonetheless forces us to ask whether the very concept of interpellation is really adequate to describe the dynamic in which individuals are caught. Here, I believe we are basically faced with two problems. The first is that Althusser elaborated the notion of interpellation before introducing in the study on reproduction the perspective of class struggle, and that he kept this notion unaltered even after elaborating the crucial idea of a non-totalizable plurality of ideologies in a social formation. The second problem is that Althusser's manuscript on reproduction stops, like the article for that matter, at the theory of ideology in general. A second volume on the class struggle in capitalist formations was foreseen, but was never written. This leaves the aspects of the concrete and material constitution of the subject unresolved. That is, it leaves unexplored, totally unexplored, the fact that ideology never exists in general, but always in concrete and determinate formations, which are always class or regional ideologies, according to Althusser. Now, I think that the question that one should ask here is the following. What are the consequences of the non-functionalist thesis presented in on the reproduction of capitalism for the conceptualization of the subject? And my idea here is that not only does such a perspective allow us to reject the thesis of Althusser's functionalism, but that it actually forces us to supplement the notion of interpellation by introducing another concept, which I will call overinterpellation. By this term, I mean to highlight that in the very analysis put forth by Althusser, the underlying principle is that individuals are never interpellated as subjects, but always as subjects in the plural. That is, that individuals are always constituted as subjects, not by one interpellation, which would be purely and simply the dominant interpellation, but by manifold and sometimes contradictory interpellations. The schema of interpellation remains, of course, the same, but one of the consequences that we can draw from the thesis of the open plurality of the ideological apparatuses or of the existence of different ideologies within the system of the apparatuses, is that the individual is caught in a network of different ideological discourses in which the imaginary recognition takes place. So to flesh out the idea of overinterpellation, I want to focus on some key lines and brief passages from chapter 12 of the book on reproduction, titled On Ideology. This is, in fact, the chapter in which Althusser introduces all the theses that then will appear in the published essay, from the idea that ideology interpellates individuals as subjects to the thesis on the material existence of ideology, which was actually presupposed by the theory of the ideological state apparatuses expounded in the previous chapters. He formulates the order of real determination of ideology upon individuals in the following way, I quote: "The subject acts insofar as he is acted by the following system. Ideology existing in a material ideological apparatus, prescribing material practices regulated by a material ritual, which practices exist in the material acts of a subject, acting in all good conscience in accordance with his beliefs," end quote. So the question here is, what about, at this point, what about what Althusser previously called secondary ideology? In another passage, which will not be reproduced in the published article, and here lies, in fact, the really crucial difference between the two texts, he links it to the problem of the concrete constitution of the subject, thus relating, albeit only implicitly, the issue of primary and secondary ideology to what we might call, by analogy, primary and secondary interpellations. I quote, "It may be objected that the subject in question could act differently. Let us recall that we said that the ritual practices in which a primary ideology is realized can produce, in the form of byproducts, a secondary ideology. Thank God, since otherwise neither revolt nor the acquisition of revolutionary consciousness nor revolution would be possible," end quote.
Can I just, Stefano, quickly to the audience, to the listeners, that all of these quotes, I have put them in chat. So if you want to have a look, they're there for you to have a look. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Here in this passage, Althusser is referring to the same subject, and this means evidently that the same individual is interpellated at the same time by at least two different ideologies. It is true that Althusser seems to suggest that this is a peculiar situation. Yet, in light of what we saw earlier, this is actually the normal situation, since primary ideology is only ever tendentially a totality. And what varies is actually only the relation of force between different interpellations. Therefore, I think there is scope here to recognize that in principle, Althusser's theory considers the possibility of plural interpellations, or of what I called overinterpellation, even if this concept is present only in a practical state in his texts, and that furthermore, the acquisition of a revolutionary consciousness finds its conditions of possibility in such a conflict of interpellations. One of the passages in which Althusser puts the concept of overinterpellation to work most clearly is, I think, an autobiographical one, to which recently Mashre also drew attention. Discussing the various ways in which he was interpellated throughout his life, Althusser attributes a crucial importance to the open plurality of interpellations by saying that concretely, and this adverb is paramount, I quote, "Ideologies never stop interpellating subjects as subjects, never stop recruiting individuals who are always already subjects. The play of ideologies is superposed, crisscrossed, contradicts itself on the same subject. The same individual is always already several times subject. Let him figure things out if he can. And we'll come back to this small phrase at the end of this passage. Thus, the concept of overinterpellation is necessary, I think, to bring to the fore the fact that in the concrete process of reproduction of the conditions of production, it is always a matter of a multiplicity of articulated interpellations. Through such a concept, it becomes possible to stress the continuous variation of the ideological interpellations, of the diverse and virtually contradictory constitutions of individuals as subjects. Above all, it becomes possible to stress that the subject itself is never of the order of the one, is never a unity, but of the order of the many. And such a multiplicity must not be considered as simply given, a given multiplicity, but as a dynamic one, eventually dependent upon a political relation of forces. It is not entirely correct, then, to state that the subject in Althusser is always of the order of the state, as many have argued, most recently, for example, Badiou, since it is clear that the subject itself is not determined by a single ideology, but rather in and by the struggle by different interpellations, being but the unstable unity and a unity in dominance, to borrow from elsewhere Althusser's own formulation, of a plurality of ideological discourses. In fact, we may even say that the concept of overinterpellation makes it clear that if it is true, as Althusser said, that the individual is always abstract with respect to the subject is abstract with respect to the subjects that a single individual always already is. Okay, we can ask at this point if for Althusser, the overinterpellation of the subject leaves them a space of freedom. Obviously, this point is particularly slippery, if anything, because of the intrinsic polysemic character of the concept of freedom. However, it is introduced by Althusser himself, even if much later, in an unpublished note written in the 80s, parts of which were then published in the 90s. Interestingly, here, he develops the same idea that was present in the book, in the manuscript on the reproduction, of a multiplicity of interpellations, adding that, I quote, ideology acts by interpellating subjects as subjects, that is, by displacing the point of their interpellation. So a child, subject of identity, Pierre, Nicolas, etc., is very early interpellated as a moral subject, you must do this and not that, and later as a scholastic, juridical, political, military, scientific, etc. End quote. It is in this displacement, which is obviously possible only on the basis of a multiplicity of interpellations, that constitutes what Althusser then calls a play in which the objective freedom of every individual is inscribed. And in this sense, the notion of overinterpellation seems to open up a space of freedom for the individual, albeit perhaps a very peculiar one, since it is defined by Althusser as objective while having to do precisely with the constitution of the subject. The problem raised by the idea of an objective freedom in this context is, however, whether it should not be complemented by a theory of subjective freedom. It is not too simplistic to ask the very basic question here. How can an overinterpellated subject render this objective freedom effective and real? Even when speaking of objective freedom, Althusser does not confront this problem, arguably because it sounded too existentialist to his ears. Yet, to say that the overinterpellation to say that overinterpellation opens up a space of freedom can have meaning only if we admit that the individual can operate a choice of some kind. Otherwise, the theory of overinterpellation will reduce the individual to multiple dependency. In other words, if we do not admit that individuals can in some way act upon their own interpellations, the idea of an objective freedom becomes problematic, becoming only a more complex determinism. But then, why speak of freedom? In reality, even if Althusser never speaks of a subjective freedom, this idea is clearly admitted by him. The emphasis on the objective side of freedom has mainly, in his discourse, the goal of subordinating, or better to say, tying the subjective freedom to its materialist conditions of existence. In fact, when he writes that the subject is caught in a play of overinterpellations, which overlap and sometimes contradict each other, as in the case of the primary and secondary interpellations, he adds, let him figure things out if he can, which in French reads, à lui de se débrouiller. This unmistakably points towards a capacity of the interpellated individual to negotiate their own interpellation, that is, their being a subject. But what does this à lui refer to? The very term used by Althusser is interesting. On the one hand, se débrouiller as a verb stresses the continual process of untying the knots of the network of interpellations. And it is significantly a reflexive verb that alludes to an activity upon oneself. And such an activity is rendered by a Latin prefix, de, which indicates a moving away. The fundamental idea behind it seems to be, therefore, very similar to that of a distance that the individual can take from their own interpellations. A capacity to se débrouiller, or figuring things out, as it is translated, therefore seems to be a fundamental part of Althusser's theory of interpellation. However underdeveloped, or perhaps even totally undeveloped, it remained. Surely, one may wonder whether Althusser did not pursue this line because he was afraid of conceding too much to a theory of subjective freedom, and perhaps this was the case. But what is central to the idea of overinterpellation is, I would argue, that it captures the field of subjection of individuals as the space in which also a liberation from a determinate ideology, as opposed to ideology in general, may take place, in which the subject lives and negotiates the sometimes contradictory demands coming from different interpellations. But it does so without turning this space into a dialectical space. It is the space of ideological conflict in which we are caught and in which the non-dialectical, overdetermined, and ultimately unforeseeable destiny of the subject is played out. In this sense, overinterpellation names the complex and overdetermined field in which frictions between individuals' multiple subject positions manifest themselves, producing both the need and the objective possibility to negotiate one's own subject position. Okay, to finish, I just want to spend a few concluding words on what I think we can perhaps hope to do with overinterpellation. As I try to argue in this paper, it is obvious that Althusser had a clear idea that interpellation as a concept was only a general concept, and that in order to capture the complexity of the ideological level or the ideological instance in its forms of existence, it was necessary to move beyond the concept of ideology in general. In this sense, overinterpellation would become the concept that would allow us to capture the concrete forms of existence of ideology rendering the analysis of a concrete situation, of an ideological concrete situation, more precise and rich, much as the concept of an overdetermined contradiction allowed Althusserian Marxism to develop a series of analyses that surpassed in depth and precision those of orthodox Marxism based on the simple contradiction between relations of production and productive forces. But it is quite evident that the concept itself needs refining, being present in Althusser's work only in a practical state and in a fragmentary manner. In the way in which Althusser presents it, or better, in the passages in which, from which it can be inferred and extracted, there is a lack of precision as regards to the way in which we should think of different interpellations and their articulation. In Althusser, and also in his disciples for that matter, ideologies or ideological formations can be distinguished in terms of class content or in terms of their regional content, that is, legal ideology, political ideology, scientific ideology, and so on. This latter aspect, I think, does not pose particular problems, as the separation or division of domains continues to these days and is, if possible, only exacerbated in the current state of affairs. Think of the institutions with a careful and repressive division of labor that renders it virtually impossible, a truly horizontal and cooperative approach. All this, of course, compensated ideologically by the mantra of interdisciplinarity. The question of class is, by contrast, more problematic, if nothing because Althusser tended to think only in binary terms, in terms of bourgeois ideology against proletarian ideology. Today, we are in a different scenario. As several thinkers have been insisting for many years now, the fronts of struggle have multiplicated, the antagonistic political subjects are diverse and multiple, etc. Most of the times, this changed scenario served as a justification for a condemnation of Althusser's Marxism. But this, I would argue, renders the need for thinking in terms of overinterpellation even more pressing, because the internal destabilization of the dominant ideology is more nuanced, multidimensional, and multifaceted today. At the same time, the authors who think of antagonism and struggle in terms of multiplicity tend to overlook the question of ideology and therefore do not conceptualize the ideological terrain in its internal unevenness and stratified temporality and conflictuality. The notion of overinterpellation in this respect would enable us to think the complexity of the subjects or the plurality of the subject forms without surrendering, as it is often the case, to the catchword of multiplicity, forcing us to think the unity in dominance of the different interpellations. That is, I would say, their internal hierarchy and articulation, and through this, their specific antagonism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefano. That was such an intense and thought-provoking lecture. I must say that it's Althusser is not a thinker that I know very well, but I learned a lot from what you've said, and I do have some questions in my mind, but I would give way first to already a question that has appeared. Just to remind everybody that at least 3 of the quotations that Stefano used are in the chat function, which you can have a look at again if you want to refresh your understanding of Althusser. And the question we have is from Giovanni Caporino. Yes, Stefano. Thanks for the outstanding presentation. I have a question on the intentionality or unintentionality of the process of unification of the dominant ideology by the ruling class. I would be happy to ask it live, but I summarize it here. So I'm sorry we can't allow you to go live, Giovanni, so I'm asking it for you. Why do you think in the manuscript, especially in the essential chapter 2, what is the mode of production, Althusser uses several times terms like, quote, mystification or imposture, which seem to clearly imply the willful intention of the ruling class to deceive the dominated class by ideology. But we know that Althusser is overall against the view of ideology as intentional mystification. However, what would be the meaning of class struggle without intentionality? So, Stefano, I think you can read the question yourself as well again.
Yes, I found it. Okay.
I read it for the sake of the recording because.
Yes. So, okay. Shall I respond now?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giovanni, for your question, and hi. So it's a very good question. Regarding the first part about chapter 2, I think that Althusser, when he wrote Sur la reproduction, so we are in like 69, I think it did not, it was still developing his theory of ideology. And I think even though it is usually said that Althusser is against the idea that ideology is mystification, it's not entirely correct because there are several parts in which actually the idea that ideology is a mystifying structure is actually there in the text. It's not an intentional mystification though, because he says that the dominant class is itself caught in this mystification. So I would distinguish between intentional mystification and mystification. So ideology operates and works on the dominant class itself. It's not the relationship between the dominant class and ideology is not instrumental only. Therefore, I think that the two issues should be separated. But it is true that the idea is there. Sometimes Althusser reverts back to an older idea of ideology. Let's say if we wanted to use to apply to Althusser the same standards that he applied to Marx, we can say that sometimes he fell back before his own break. Let's say. So this can be an explanation for what you can find in chapter 2 of that book. And it is symptomatic that he decided not to publish that work. Maybe there were also other reasons, but I think that his theory in general on ideology and reproduction was not satisfied with what he had, and he published only that little part, leaving aside also, as we've seen today, leaving aside so many things that could have complicated and his own theory. So this is the first point. And what would be the meaning of class struggle without intentionality? Well, in a sense, class struggle it depends on which level we want to think of intentionality. I think Althusser is against the idea that something that is related to a class or related to masses can be thought under the concept of intentionality, which is a concept coming from phenomenology. So everything that is related to a subject as a single center seems suspicious to him. And rightly so, I would say, because he was trying to think of of the masses, for example, in the 72 text, the reply to John Lewis, as something different from subjects. So the problem is, for him, is when we move from the subject understood very much in the traditional philosophical sense, post-Kantian, post-Cartesian, can we just transfer and take those categories applied to conscience and consciousness and transfer them to the collective subject? His answer was no. So there is struggle, and the effects of struggle are not necessarily the outcomes of an intentionality, because history is, of course, for us to say a process without a subject. This doesn't mean, I think, that there can be a project behind class struggle. And when he wrote on reproduction of capitalism, 69, for him, the unification of the struggle was given by the party, and that was the problem. So he was a Leninist in that sense, even though a very critical one. So the meaning of class struggle without intentionality, I think Althusser, this would be his answer. Then my answer is that, of course, there is the need of a certain intentionality of a project, but I wouldn't call that intentionality because it would retrieve the jargon of subjectivity. I hope to have answered the question.
And myself.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just to stop noises, I was. So we have two more questions. One very long one from Jacob. And Jacob says, thank you for a great talk. I wonder if you could say a bit more about subjective freedom. What do you think that the freedom of the individual, which I believe you at one point called a distance, which I imagine is an internal distance, is necessary for you or for Althusser? Isn't your concept of over-interpellation compatible with the view which sees the possibility of freedom of the subject in a relation with exterior factors interpolating the subject, factors which can be changed in political activity without having a recourse to internal distance? In other words, can we not have a subject without internal freedom, whose freedom has to be ensured by changing external ideological institutions, ideas, legal and political relations? I guess this is saying there is no choice, but there is freedom, or whatever. Let's say what you think.
Well, I think that yes, in a sense, I agree. So especially what you say at the end, can we not have a subject without internal freedom, whose freedom has to be ensured by changing external ideological institutions? Yes. The point is that this freedom about which Althusser talks is objective in the sense that it is the transposition within the subjective dimension of its own objective conditions of existence. So the idea there, and I think that I agree with Althusser on this point, there is no such thing as total freedom. There is only a freedom of choice between different interpellations, and the space of our mind, what we call our mind, is divided between the options that are actually available. And the but what is important is to stress, though, that Althusser, it doesn't really deny that we can choose or do something with our interpellations. The real problem is that the subject alone cannot do enough to change the set of interpellations, because for that it is necessary. It is absolutely necessary to move to a collective level of political action, right? But of course we can negotiate certain the power that certain interpellations have upon us. Not always, but we can potentially. So I can decide whether to vote for the right or for the left, or whether I want to do a political subject or a totally non-political subject, because these are actually options that are given to me. And but these are given because of an objective structure that is there, and to change the structure itself, the individual is not enough. For Althusser, obviously, only masses make history, which means that we need to move to a collective level. But this kind of freedom, is the objective freedom, is a distance from a determinate ideology that dominates us at a certain point, in a certain moment, and which we can counter, taking side for another interpellation, another ideology. So we can just move between the two or the three or the four, etc. In this sense, I think it is important to stress this against the idea that is still widespread and was widespread, that Althusser think of the subjects, individuals and subjects, only as machines, basically. But that's not entirely correct. And the crucial thing is that you cannot escape ideology entirely, but we can escape certain ideologies, which is imaginary formations, and certain ideological formations are clearly better than others. And that's where the party, taking sides, can perhaps operate. So yes, I would say this.
Okay, there's one more question. I will just say quickly that you have thanks from Ian Campbell and William Willett for a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much.
The, the,
Hi.
the question is from Karthik Ramanoharan, and he says also, thanks for the great presentation, Stefano. I have a very basic question. If ideology is total, what position does the ideology critic, I suppose he means ideological critic, occupy, especially whose surname is not Zizek?
Okay. Okay, so the critique, I take it to mean ideological critique. Okay, so we can criticize ideology for Althusser in two ways, in a sense. He had this view that there is the epistemological break between ideology and science. So for him, the real critique of ideology can only come from science. Which means we need to break with the ideological subjection to get to this level of scientific level where there is no really subject and object, but there are processes of theoretical work. And in that sense, you can break with ideology. But at the same time, the problem for Althusser is that we can never break with ideology forever, because human beings are ideological animals. So we can criticize ideology because from the point of view of science, so achieving the scientific level, this means that we need to criticize and take distance from ideology. As Althusser said with regards to Marx, so Marx was capable of breaking with his Hegelian past because he criticized the Hegelian ideology. So in this sense, there is no science, if not the science of a certain ideology. And this is the break. Then it is also true that with respect to another tradition, which is the more Frankfurt School tradition of ideological critique of ideology, in Althusser is a theory of ideology. And so it's something different. And the problem of critique understood from the point of view, for example, of Adorno, is more problematic. But his idea of science contains, in that sense, the very idea of critique.
Right. So we have a challenging question from your old friend, our old friend, Maria. So Maria said,
okay.
Hi, Stefano. Thank you for your brilliant lecture. Could you please elaborate on the inner drives that enable subject to negotiate the incoming as internal stimuli, interpellations? How are they reflected and made for ourselves? If we are to return to the subject and freedom, it seems to me that the subjective negotiation of the overinterpellations comes close to the liberal concept of the freedom of choice. We are free to choose our interpellation. So here's a challenge. Is it
okay
into a liberal concept of freedom?
Okay. Challenge accepted. Okay. Hi, Maria, and thank you for your question. So I do not think that we are free to, we're totally free to choose our interpellations, but it is true that we can be exposed to different interpellations and therefore make assessment on certain interpellations. And I think because if for Althusser, obviously we are ideological animals, and I think I agree with this, but we are not only ideological animals. We are also animals capable of critical reflection and science. And in that sense, there is a moment where we can take a distance from our past, for example, from the interpellations that always dominated us. The problem of the drives, the inner drives that enable subject to negotiate the incoming interpellations, that's problematic, because the link between the unconscious and the ideological in Althusser is much more complex than it is usually recognized in secondary literature. If you look at secondary literature on Althusser, you normally find that Althusser's theory of ideology makes the ideological equal to the unconscious, but that's not true. There are some notes from the that were published posthumously in '67, where Althusser tries to separate the ideological from the unconscious, and I think there he comes very close to a sort of attachment to a certain ideological interpellation, which is unconscious, but the ideological interpellation is not unconscious in itself. So this is more, I think, Zizek's perspective, but in Althusser, ideology hasn't got to do so much with the unconscious level, although the interpellation, the operation of interpellation escapes the consciousness of that very interpellation. So we are not really capable of conceptualizing it. We are first of all subject to this interpellation, and so this is very problematic. For the liberal concept of freedom, I think that freedom of choice in the liberal tradition is much more related to a total freedom of choice. So assuming that we are free to choose our future and our life project, whereas so this is the standard view in liberalism. We have all the rights that we need, and we can do whatever we want and become rich, etc. But Althusser ties it to the objective conditions when he says that the play of interpellation is the objective freedom, and the objective freedom is very much related to the ideological conjuncture that we are living. So if a certain conjuncture is such that the antagonism at the ideological level contained in this conjuncture is very high, then it means that we have different interpellations conflicting at all levels. And in that sense, we can perhaps take sides and decide, for example, to fight for the liberation of a certain country from fascism, as it was in Italy during the last years of the Second World War, or not. So there we can take side, but that's not, I don't see that as a dangerously close to the liberal idea, because it's not a total and unconnected from material conditions freedom. But thank you for the question. Hope to have been able to reply.
So there's a question from John Roberts, and before I read that question, there's also a comment from Afri Majumdar in the chat box. Thank you for the brilliant lecture and stimulating discussion. So that's a congratulatory message for you. John Roberts says, can you talk about your relationship to Laclau? It appears your concept of over-interpellation owes something to Laclau.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for the question, and hi. Yes, you are actually you're right. The sense that it has something to do with Laclau, and although in the sense of how I arrived to over-interpellation, that was I arrived at this concept before basically reading Laclau seriously. But I find that Laclau can provide a way forward in a sense. The problem of antagonism and subject positions is obviously there, and also in his first book on politics and ideology in Marxist theory presents a very interesting idea of a structure of interpellations, which I only recently discovered. So that's why, in fact, I'm working a new book on from Althusser to Laclau, to problematize the concept of interpellation further. My problem with, for example, hegemony and socialist strategy is that the idea of multiple subject positions does not really include the problem of ideology and subjection. So it moves too quickly outside of ideology, if perhaps. So I also think that Laclau owes a lot to Michel Peychaud, maybe not a lot, but something. And so there is a hidden link going from Althusser to Peychaud Laclau. But this is precisely what I'm trying to, what I'm studying in this period. But certainly, I owe something to Laclau. That's true, at least in the new developments.
Thank you. I think we shall end here. It's unless someone has a question which they've held back till now, they're welcome to put it in. But I think we are coming to a close. It's 5:10, and I just want to say thank you very much, Stefano, for this brilliant lecture. Yeah, we have your ex-student Cameron saying thank you very much. So there you are.
Thank you.
We have people who you have taught and introduced to the world of philosophy and who remember you with such fondness, who are attending the lecture today.
Of course.
Not just your colleagues, your ex-students too. So I, on that note, really want to say thank you so much, Stefano, and I hope we will come again and we will organize another lecture, maybe when you are right through your second book, which you just told us about towards the end of
It will be my pleasure.
Yes, and
maybe in person also. That would be great. In person and not online.
Absolutely. That really should be our aim when the world has become a less harsh place.
Yeah.
We would love to have you over in Wolverhampton. And to everyone else, please do join us for our Royal Institute of Philosophy lectures and other lectures that we organize in the University of Wolverhampton. And it's always a pleasure to host these lectures, which we've been organizing since 2003. We've probably done about 50 lectures by now. And it's always a pleasure to have such fantastic speakers from all over the world that come and deliver their lectures here. With Stefano, of course, we have a special relationship, which is not just of a guest lecturer, but someone who has contributed to the University of Wolverhampton and philosophy at University of Wolverhampton. And so thank you again, Stefano, and thanks to everyone who have spent their time to attend today.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much.